Welcome to this Smart Cities Council webinar. We are going to talk today about unlocking the opportunities in New Zealand and the role of smart infrastructure. I will ask our panelists in a second to introduce themselves, and then we will dive into a bit of an exploration of infrastructure opportunities and the role of smart infrastructure in addressing the country's quite pressing infrastructure shortfall. And they'll be able to tell us a little bit more about the very urgent need for climate resilient and more digitally enabled and connected urban environments. Mark, can I start with you, our Smart Cities Council lead for New Zealand?
Robin, thanks. Kia ora, everyone. Mark Thomas. I lead the Smart Cities Council in New Zealand. As Robin said, I also am the Managing Director of ServiceWorks. We're an urban technologies business applying products and technology solutions to some of the city challenges we have. We've been involved with the Smart Cities Council for about 5 years. And one of the things we did in New Zealand last year was establish a framework for a climate technology roadmap to help New Zealand deploy technology more strategically as part of the country response to climate challenges.
Thanks, Mark. And Matt McClay?
Good morning, Matt McClay. I'm the IoT sales lead at Spark New Zealand. I lead a team of individuals within our IoT practice. We have 45 people within Spark that are concentrated on IoT and the things that we can deliver for New Zealand.
Thank you, Matt. And then to Matthew Willard.
Kia ora koutou katoa. It's great to be here today to share my views on the infrastructure challenges that face Aotearoa New Zealand. One of the privileges I've had working at Oricon is the work that we do spans across the full spectrum of infrastructure asset owners and infrastructure asset types. In my current role, I lead our infrastructure advisory practice group that is really set up to establish and support organizations and clients to with their infrastructure investment choices and maintaining their assets over their life cycle. So it's an increasingly important facet of the infrastructure challenge and opportunity that our country faces, and look forward to engaging with this panel today.
Thanks, Matthew. And Kerry is just signing back in. Kerry is the digital practice lead for Oricon in New Zealand. I'm going to start with a question for everyone. And Mark, if we can start with you, then go to Matt and then Matthew. Can you give us a bit of insight from your perspective on the infrastructure challenges at the moment and what the most critical gaps are that need urgent attention?
Look, we have the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, which was established a couple of years ago. And if anyone hasn't checked them out, they do a good job of articulating, I guess, a 30-year view of what those challenges are. They're considerable. I boil them down to three broad areas. The first is aging and underfunded core infrastructure. So that's quite a big area. That's road, public transport systems, water. The Commission estimates that New Zealand should be doubling its GDP spending in that area, so from 5.5% to 10% increase, an extra $31 billion, so opportunity for some private financing assistance there. So that's one big category. Secondly, and partly because we work in the transport area, I'd say it's the transport congestion and inefficiencies we have. You can have better roading, but you've also got to have interconnected public transport systems. So there's an infrastructure piece in terms of how our transport system connects to that's missing. And thirdly, aligned to that is a lack of digital infrastructure investment. And so cities still underutilized IoT, AI or data-driven planning infrastructure as part of business as usual.
Thanks, Mark. And Matt McClay?
Look, to reiterate on what Mark said from an infrastructure gap, we've got leaking water infrastructure, fairly old, needs significant investment. Those transport networks are very congested, and things like route planning and how we get people places faster is obviously a major hassle. And also we've got a significant issue around climate resistance and whether or not and where we choose to build and have people populated.
Brilliant. Matt Willard.
Rather than repeating what the others have said really well, I think that there is a confluence of key drivers that we face at our current point in time, and they're not new. It's whether they're the need to renew our infrastructure that is rapidly approaching its end of life. It's responding to our changing demographics and population growth. And that not only changes the nature of the infrastructure required, but also in building capacity to meet the shortfall. I also think it's responding to the effects of climate change, so meaning decarbonisation, building resilience and adaptation initiatives. There's responding to technological changes. As a non-data person here, I hope to be the first one to use the AI term on the call, but also there's the need to respond to cost escalation, and that's usually through labours and materials. So honing in on supply chains and sector capability development, which is going to be key to us in terms of meeting the challenge that is presented. But infrastructure fundamentally is vital to our way of life and supports everything that we do. And for me, what we're seeing is decades long present and persistent underinvestment in our infrastructure assets. And what we cannot assume is that there's going to be a silver bullet to solve that chronic and persistent underinvestment. So what we need to think about is the opportunities for real systems leadership, the opportunity for long-term and structured planning of the infrastructure asset classes that we face, thinking about how we not only segregate whether it's transport or water, but what are the learnings that we can share across different sectors at the same time to eke out those efficiency gains. Look, I think the investment in infrastructure is a key lever that central, local government and private sector can deploy in order to support us through our economic growth and also to improve our productivity.
And Mark, if we zoom out a little bit, how do you think that New Zealand's approach to smart infrastructure specifically compares to global practices? Where are we leading? Where do we need to catch up?
The good news is we do have a strength emerging in terms of our sustainability focus, perhaps unsurprisingly, particularly integrating climate resilience into infrastructure in terms of planning. And the best example that I can give, because I'm familiar with it, is the Making Space for Water planning that Auckland has done over the last couple of years. It was underway before the very significant floods that Auckland experienced in early 2023. But this is quite an integrated program of, for example, blue-green network planning. So that's looking at ways to use stormwater strategically, to make space for it also, but to see what other ways it can add to the ecosystem. Obviously, having a high-risk or at-risk property management strategy. Flood path management is also part of it, of course, as well. Flood intelligence, starting to see more data tools being used to plan where the risk elements are in the case of significant events. And also establishing more community-led flood resilience, which is certainly a trend you've seen in overseas jurisdictions. So that's a big category of work. Another area where New Zealand is distinctive, perhaps unsurprisingly, is what's being referred to as Māori-led infrastructure planning. And I draw people's attention, if they're not familiar with it, to Ngāi Tahu's approach. So that's the very large South Island iwi for international attendees to the webinar. And the approach that they've taken to their infrastructure development is unique. And I think that's something that I understand people are looking at more closely.
Thanks, Mark. Matt, based on the research that you've recently done within Oricon, can you talk a little bit to some of the key policy and funding levers that could potentially unlock some more value from New Zealand's infrastructure investments?
Yeah, absolutely. New Zealand is already building quite a comprehensive kete of funding and financing tools to address its significant infrastructure challenges. These include things like the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which uses levies to fund large-scale projects such as the Moa wastewater treatment plant in Wellington, debt financing, which is fairly traditional, conventional, other options around public-private partnerships are becoming more in vogue, and these enable collaboration with the private sector to build, finance, and operate infrastructure projects. For those in Australia on the call, you're very familiar with that, but becoming more familiar within the New Zealand context. There are other tools such as user pay mechanisms, such as tolls or water usage fees, and initiatives like the local water done well policy, which enables council-controlled organisations or local councils to access increasing debt funding for their water infrastructure. To complement those traditional methods and emerging methods for funding and financing infrastructure, our infrastructure advisory team, in collaboration with Infrastructure New Zealand, released a white paper exploring the concept of asset recycling, which is a new funding approach that allows to unlock the economic value from our existing infrastructure assets through mechanisms such as leases or strategic partnerships with the private sector. The resulting capital is then ring-fenced and reinvested into the delivery of new or upgraded infrastructure rather than doing other things such as debt or paying off debt. An example of this is Napier's Port 6 wharf development. To finance the roughly $200 million project, the port sold a 45% stake through an initial IPO, raising about $86 million. This avoided significant debt and substantial rate hikes for the Hawke's Bay residents, whilst boosting the port's capacity and profitability, thereby benefiting the region. So in our report, we call on the central government to introduce a policy framework to support the uptake of asset recycling as a new tool to add to that kete, but also strong system leadership is essential for implementing an effective change. The asset recycling paper is going to be discussed further at the port conference in Christchurch in May, and we hope to start to ignite a conversational topic around how to maximize the benefit from our existing infrastructure as distinct from all the other funding and financing tools, which tend to be more appropriate for new investments in infrastructure.
Thanks, Matt. Just again, the event in May that you mentioned?
That's the Apolpo Asset Management Professionals Conference.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We'll get some info from you and pop that with a link to the report in the session notes. I'm going to move across now to some tech and data-driven drivers. So Matt McClay, connectivity as a key enabler for smart infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit to how Spark specifically is helping build some of those connectivity pieces within urban environments, and what role 5G IoT playing?
Connectivity is a real enabler. It's a sort of a foundation in regards to how you get the information from where you want to where it's important. To that end, we've seen a 25% growth in our connectivity business, 2.2 million connections in IoT. And so those are anything from water meters to electricity meters to loggers that are out there giving information and providing real-time feedback in regards to what's happening. And then, of course, over the top of that, with 5G, it starts to bring into things like advanced analytics, real-time camera feeds, where you can start to get a better picture of what's happening and manage for that congestion or those issues real-time, as opposed to near real-time or in the past where it was a study-based product where someone actually collected the data and then collated it. Now you can make that information available straight away. And so part of the exciting part about that is our different partners that we have from a network perspective. So partners like Nokia allows us to deploy and bring new innovation that they have to our network and provide that to our customers as part of that service offering.
Thanks, Matt. I want to pause and ask a group question around the role of data and how we see data making smart infrastructure decisions. Oh, she popped out. No, she's back. So how can we effectively use data to guide investment, and what role do we see it playing in helping us all make smarter infrastructure decisions? Mark, can I start with you?
Look, I think the theory about the role that data plays is probably known to most people attending this webinar. It's predictive maintenance value, it's optimization value, for example, with transport and other networks, and of course, improving resilience planning. The best reference point, or one of the best reference points, I think, for New Zealand to talk about, and I appreciate it's a bit of a touchy subject for Australians, is our national broadband rollout program, initiated in 2011, completed substantially in 2022. So that used, even way back then, comprehensive data analysis to identify areas with the greatest need for internet speed as a way of triaging where and how the asset investment flows should go. So I think that's a good example, a case study, for example, of a very significant infrastructure project that was informed by data plays. New Zealand, like many jurisdictions, collects a great deal of data, but doesn't integrate it effectively across agencies. Hence, the Infrastructure Commission I referenced earlier made a special case of saying that digital twins, and I know we're going to talk about that some more, need to form part of the architecture for New Zealand's planning, partly because they see digital twins as the key enabler for solving the data problem. The data problem being this disaggregation that exists across agencies. There is progress, of course, that's being made in that area. City Council, Wellington City Council are probably the two leaders in New Zealand in terms of developing digital twins as a way of solving the data challenge. And Auckland Transport too, the Transport Authority in Auckland, has developed a platform that they use to integrate real-time data, GIS mapping, and 3D modeling. So look, there's work underway. The value, I think, is obvious, and I think it's good to reference specific examples of where the value is demonstrating value for people to look at and perhaps use that in their business cases.
Thank you for pointing that out. The use cases, the critical piece always. Matthew Willard, do you want to take a crack?
Yeah, I think we do really well at designing for infrastructure with that data and information mindset. I think what New Zealand doesn't do very well, and potentially many other jurisdictions, is around designing for the life of that infrastructure asset. Since we're talking about fiber, spent a bit of time analyzing fiber, and there was a long-held view that the replacement age for fiber was something like 30 years. So we tend to just go through time-based replacement of that asset. So we've built this great broadband fiber connectivity network, and that fiber is going to be replaced over a period of time. And a lot of the forward investment plans historically were built on an assumption around the age of fiber when you need to replace it. However, in the operational phase, through remote fiber monitoring, we can now accurately target where the drop-off in data or attenuation of fiber sections is likely to take place, utilize things like machine learning to build a forward CapEx work plan for that fiber replacement, so we can do targeted intervention and look to optimize the network as a whole, rather than look to just cut out sections of that fiber network and replace it given its age. So I think that there are further enhancements that we can make as part of the build program to think about how would we operate this. If a building company invests, or if an organization invests in infrastructure and designs it and builds it, how do we optimize for its operational life cycle, and where's the data that is needed in order to capture that ongoing optimization post-construction? So I think that's a really key opportunity around how do we not only guide the investment, but realize the return on that investment as fast as possible. So I think there's a huge opportunity in that data, and we see that also in terms of the water network around leakage rates and how we can model those leakage rates to inform where future leaks might occur and look to do some move from a reactive state to a proactive state in managing our networks.
And Matt McClay, from your perspective?
Yeah, look, Matt brings up a good point there with regards to the water infrastructure and leakage detection and so forth. What we see there is not having to monitor the entire network, but monitor parts of the network to get that information, and then having the right access to the network to bring that information back. To that end, we operate 3 different networks for IoT connected devices, and they're standards based, and they've got an elongated lifespan, which is important when you're putting sensors out in the field. You don't want them becoming obsolete within 5 years. So 10 to 15 years is totally acceptable from a device perspective, and it underlines that cost that you're actually spending on getting that information. And then, of course, coordinating that data back to someone who's actually going to use it for good purposes.
And keeping on that coordination thread, Mark, you you just mentioned digital twins. We've been talking about it a lot, of course, and AI is, of course, a nice buzzword at the moment. Let's talk about cities globally. Is anyone you're seeing using digital twins, AI, predictive analytics to optimize infrastructure planning? And how can New Zealand better integrate all of these technologies?
Look, yes, indeed there are. And of course, the common reference point for anyone in New Zealand is Singapore, of course, who've been using their version in their unique environment for a number of years now. On a bigger scale, the UK has a national digital twin program that it's a little more challenging, and I suppose that makes it a little bit more relevant for New Zealand because, of course, you have a strong central government in the UK, and then you have highly devolved local governments, some of which actually have quite big responsibilities, somewhat analogous to the situation we have with Auckland in New Zealand. So I think the answer is to certainly be across some of the innovations and approaches that the Singapore digital twin have developed. There are good insights, I think, in terms of building the use case. But then I think in terms of informing what should be done in New Zealand, starting with the digital twin architecture in the UK, and also being informed by the approach that New South Wales and Victoria have taken just across the ditch. Both those states, of course, have spent a great deal investing in versions of digital twins. And look, there's things to learn from those. And I think the people involved with those practices would agree. We want to develop the best practice for Aotearoa, and that's going to be a function of those different jurisdictions. I think taking the things that have worked, looking at where there have been challenges. What we know the answer can't be in New Zealand is 78 versions of a digital twin. We have 78 local government authorities. And so inevitably, there does need to be a leadership role at the central area. We have a Minister of Digitising New Zealand, government in New Zealand. I'm optimistic that once she's focused on the immediate priorities she has, she might turn her attention to this recommendation in the Infrastructure Commission's report, because the opportunities for the emerging technologies such as AI for predictive maintenance, for example, are clear and being utilized actually in the private sector. You've got large elevator companies, for example, using predictive AI for the maintenance for elevators. So it's already being deployed by the private sector. The public sector is a bit of a laggard in this area. And I think some of those reference points I've talked about can be insights for how New Zealand can make progress.
The titling of this webinar was so spot on, and I have to give you credit for that, Mark. The opportunity is the key point. We have a new minister, exactly right, let them settle into their role, but the amalgamation of all of this knowledge and practice is going to be extremely exciting and unlock a lot if we can get it right. Kerry, let us know if you can pop your video or audio on, because I do have a question for you. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Matt Willard if you can speak a bit to some of the barriers to scaling digital solutions and how we can overcome them.
I think we recently advised a transport agency around how to maximize value from digitizing its operations across the full asset life cycle. Our experience in New Zealand and that internationally revealed, like, there's a common challenge that there are pockets of digital initiatives. And I think, like you mentioned, the 78 local authorities, they often operate separately from each other, and within organizations that might be national, they operate separately from their business objectives, therefore creating inefficiencies and tension between whether they are asset management and digital strategies. So to help think about how could we digitalize its operations and shape a program, we needed to provide and guide leadership to make decisions on the scale and the pace of digitalization first. So being aware of that scale and the pace, they helped to design an implementation roadmap with various options. But there were 3 key insights that we uncovered, and this is across different sectors, but there's that strong need for accountability and ownership and system leadership. That is really important in the pace and change of digitization, because what we're seeing is that constant cycle of leadership going through organizations, and strong and stable leadership to execute the strategy and the plan in order to realize the benefits that are being sought is very crucial in order to continue the momentum of that change. Some of the key drivers too is around aligning digitalization with the focus around what is the return on the investment that we're making into digitalizing our end-to-end services. In some cases, digitalization is sought to drive an aspirational something like 20% of efficiency gains around how they manage the asset portfolio. With those types of visions and aspirational statements, that there does need to be a relentless focus and aligned action on that transformation journey. So it's a long vision, but there are short steps in order to make sure that you're heading in the right trajectory. So clear KPIs to monitor that progress are very important, and will be a challenge if you're needing to scale up those pilot initiatives into a full-size organization or national view around digitization or digital twins. So there is a significant challenge it's there, but I think a key part is that we do really well at piloting. We need to scale that up, and that really needs to focus on that system-wide leadership in order to realize the return on investment and to standardize the pockets of greatness across the country and across organizations.
Thanks, Matthew. I'd like to switch a little bit now to some investment and policy-based questions. Mark, if I can start with you. We've mentioned barriers already, but if you can talk to some of the biggest roadblocks from a policy and funding regulation perspective, or if there's something else that we've missed completely.
I think there are 4 big roadblocks, or I choose to see 4 categories, I suppose, as a way of navigating through it. One is the absence of a national plan, which the good news is, because we need to have this both a good news and otherwise news webinar, is that by the end of this year, New Zealand will have its first national plan delivered by this now famous Infrastructure Commission I've mentioned. Of course, having a plan is nothing if it's not then realised. It's good to have a plan, but you then need to look at the other 3 roadblocks that I've identified, and the big one, of course, as always, is funding. So and Matthew talked about this earlier, we don't have flexible enough funding tools. Ironically, money, in fact, is generally not seen to be the problem. That is to say, international capital is available. We heard our Prime Minister talking about that recently. He travels overseas and trillions to invest, who say, I didn't know about New Zealand. So that seems to be perhaps not a big problem. Of course, what we then have to do is to present the opportunities for it to be invested here, and much more down to scale. There need to be other ways that we can make funding more attractive, frankly, for some investors. And so the proposal that the government has to look at, for example, remitting a GST on new developments to local councils could be an example of incentivizing local councils to move in that direction. The other two roadblocks are regulatory delays and skill shortages. And so regulation is obviously a key part of what this new National Infrastructure Agency, where you get a new government, you get new agencies. So that's a new agency that's been established. And its point is to try to better coordinate and facilitate action. So effectively deliver this plan that will be delivered at the end of the year. And aligned to that will be addressing the skill shortage issue, of course. If we don't have a pipeline of investment that's certain, unsurprisingly, that's going to impact where private sector will put their forward investment plans and what the prospects are for skills to be able to, in fact, deliver the infrastructure plan. So look, that's a way that I look at those roadblocks, and also maybe some insights into what the potential solutions might be.
Thanks, Mark. Matt Maclay, what do you think the role is of private sector in accelerating this infrastructure adoption? So are there some examples you can share of maybe public-private collaborations that we can learn from?
Yeah, look, we operated the Accelerate AO2 ROA Fund, which is a fund that we put up as a private entity to help entities around innovation in the space that could use IoT or 5G to further advance what they were trying to do. And despite the challenging economic timeframes or period that we're going through, we've continued that investment. So investing in the network to ensure that it's better, faster, and more available, and then allowing customers to consume that money in the innovation funds to develop what they're trying to do, and then helping them along the way with that, with our partnerships. So those strong partnerships, like I mentioned before with Nokia, bringing those people into those conversations with our customers to help them deliver on what they're trying to achieve.
And Spark also ran a mini AI MBA last year. I'm not sure if it's still running. I'll find out and put it in the chat. But things like that, I think, are also quite important in skills gap.
That mini MBA has been fantastic. There's actually another one available start of March. We can send some details through for that. But that's working with the crew at Section. And so from an introduction to AI and how that might better help you in your business, that's something that we can assist with.
Fantastic. Matt Willard, let's look at infrastructure policy then in New Zealand. Where do you see the greatest potential for reform to unlock investment and innovation? And this links a bit to a question in the chat that's on how we get better adoption and stronger investment in New Zealand.
There's been an increased focus around, in particular, public sector agencies to demonstrate that they are being better stewards of the assets that they are tasked with managing to deliver services for the citizens of New Zealand. So that's, I think, going to be a key change in terms of the expectations set on senior executives in the public sector. But I think that there are two parts. One is that we have pockets of really great work being done around digital investment in New Zealand, or digitization or digital innovation. But I think we need to think about how do we accelerate that change. So bringing in private investment could do wonders for the sector, in my view. And that is on top of already a strong view around bringing in private sector investment for infrastructure. So that's the first thing, is as we consider the need for building new infrastructure across the country, embedding in digital innovation in terms of how that is executed and delivered over the life cycle of the asset will be a key part of any decision that is made around that infrastructure investment. And we're seeing some great steps around how to accelerate that through the Crown Infrastructure Partners as being rebranded as the National Infrastructure Funding and Financing Agency, with the goal to connect international capital with public infrastructure projects. We've talked about the need for asset recycling, which is about partnering with the private sector on our existing infrastructure assets. There's also the Community Housing Funding Agency, which is investigating private funding and financing to invest in our built social housing stock that can then reduce the burden on funding or financing through central government over the long term. I guess the key part around the reform is around accelerating the need for the private sector to work in collaboration with the public sector in order to realize or identify and realize the benefits from digital innovation. That's probably, my view. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And now let's look ahead. So pathway forward. And I have two questions for all of you. First up, if you could change one thing today to accelerate smart infrastructure adoption in New Zealand, what would it be, Mark?
Look, I think it would be the establishment of a national open data platform that was championed. Many of the cities have versions of that, particularly through transport networks, but they're not openly championed. And the reason I say that, rather than, say, for example, a national smart infrastructure strategy, which also would be great, and I hope that'll be an element of what comes out at the end of the year, creating something that's an open data network really encourages innovation and permits those people who already think they know the answers, but perhaps are not as closely connected to those who are perhaps working on them, to provide them. So an open data platform, you might think that's an ironic thing to suggest in an infrastructure webinar, but I think that would be the one thing that would create both information, responses, answers, assistance, guidance that actually would assist with much more strategic and much more significant infrastructure plays.
Stay tuned as well, because Mark and I are going to be having a chat with some great people in New Zealand in the open data space. So there'll be more to come on that. Matt McClay?
Oh, look, I think there's an ability or an opportunity there to be better at sharing what works across the organisations. So you've got different organisations doing things really well, but not very good at promoting what they're up to. So sharing that back with the Smart Cities Council and so forth allows other entities to see what's been happening. There's a real positive aspect from that.
Thanks, Matt. That's great. And Matthew Willard?
Yeah, I think the open data and data sharing and information sharing about what is working and a forum that enables that cross-sharing of knowledge is something that is really important. But what underpins that is that strong leadership that forces us to think about infrastructure over a 30-year horizon. So that's not just the building, it's the maintaining, it's the operating, it's the renewing it over that life cycle, which helps to really embed the case for digital investment, because the long-term horizon that we operate this infrastructure for requires a way of thinking around how do I collect data autonomously or remotely and then use it to predict or maintain it in its long term. I think that what we're missing is that strong system leadership that takes that long-term view rather than just cycling through every 3 years and we're picking up where we left off last time and starting all over again sometimes. I think with infrastructure being long-term, we can spread the investment and thinking over the long term and incrementally build on it over time through the initiatives that the Mark and Nat have shared earlier.
Thank you. My final question really is to ask the same thing, but really as your message to government leaders, to industry leaders who want to see change, what is your key message to them in terms of the next step that needs to be taken? Mark, you got one?
Yeah, I have the perennial message. It's you need to be bolder and you need to act sooner. The good news is we have this huge challenge, this $31 billion of additional infrastructure investment we have to spend. So that's a big problem to have. And what a time then with the technology developments that we are seeing to be bolder and to act sooner. And there's been a delayed investment more generally in digital investment in New Zealand, I think partly for the perennial reasons we know. People have been waiting to be sure that the particular technology was the technology that was going to be the one, costs associated with scale, that sort of thing. The good news with what we're seeing with AI and its associated impacts is hopefully the business cases for that kind of investment have a bit of a lower hurdle now. I'm not saying the cost hurdle falls, but the opportunity hurdle now, I think, is clearer. And so what that needs leaders to do, and those critically advising leaders, is to be clearer about both the scale of the problem, but also the massive scale of the opportunity if we're bolder with our prioritising of digital investment and smart infrastructure.
Thanks, Mark. And Matt McClay?
I'd really like to see there be some form of innovation fund available at a government level to help prove out some of this technology as well. Someone has to go first, and if you've got some of these major infrastructure projects happening and some of the technology has been proved overseas, and then it's a case of actually just bringing that to New Zealand. I know that's been quite successful in parts of Australia with different federal policies and plans that are available to help assist in that way.
There's a really great question in the chat around whether there is enough information about the monetized return from use cases in New Zealand and around the world. And I'm going to address that in the write-up. For now, I'd just like to say thank you so much to our panelists and to our listeners. We'll be getting a recording out to everyone and pop contact information in the session notes. But thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that the next time we meet, we'll be able to discuss some of the progress that's been made in realizing this opportunity that sits right in front of us. Kerry, if you can do a quick introduction.
Hi, I'm Kerry. I'm Digital Principal with Oricon, based here in Christchurch in New Zealand.
Thanks, Kerry. So, setting the context, we'd asked Mark for his insight into how New Zealand approaches smart infrastructure compared to global best practices. And Kerry, if you can, from an engineering and planning perspective, give us some insight into some of the opportunities, the biggest opportunities for smart infrastructure to address New Zealand's pressing transport and housing issues.
I guess that the scenario we have at the moment where unilaterally government is asking people to do more with less in itself creates an opportunity. So I feel like the prerequisite for being able to actually take hold of that opportunity is that we need to know where we currently stand. So if you're an asset owner, having a good grasp of the state of your assets. So where are they geographically? What condition are they in? Are they being used to their maximum potential? Is there capacity that could be used in better ways? Those sorts of things. Having that understanding is actually probably the first opportunity. And then once that is put in place, then obviously that unlocks the potential around using data to make better decisions. And therefore, can we leverage smart infrastructure, so AI, IoT devices, the full spectrum of technology, but to have it positioned for the right purpose?
Perfect, thank you. And on tech and data, I asked a general question on the role of data and about some examples around digital twins, AI, and better integration. My question for you, Kerry, is if you could share a recent example of a smart infrastructure project, either in New Zealand or abroad, that significantly improved efficiency, sustainability, or resilience.
I think those three things are huge in themselves. Whether you might invest in your infrastructure to improve resilience, for example. Resilience obviously means different things in different geographies and in different contexts as well. For example, the great challenge we have in New Zealand around seismic resilience and resilience to natural disasters, But what we are seeing is across industry a lot of collaboration. So if I take the water industry, the learnings that can be passed on from organisations in Australia and applied to organisations here in New Zealand. So, for example, if we think about some of the work that Sydney Water have been doing around digitising their strategic asset management plans, going back to what I said before, is can they get their data into a state where it can be used to drive more impactful decision making in their definition of contribution to sustainability and resilience and so forth. And through the network of organisations across Australia and New Zealand, that type of information is being reused here. So what are the experience that Sydney Water had, and how can that be shared across New Zealand to accelerate their work in that area? So we're seeing a lot of that sort of thing, and it's not just about, again, the use of technology, it's how do we bring it all together into a system where we can actually understand the inputs in terms of like external data sources, how they're being used, how they impact the system, what is the health of our asset data, how do we trust it, are we using it the right way, those sorts of things. So it's a big question, but effectively it's a whole of life approach. And we're seeing that really start to create an impact across the whole kind of network of infrastructure.
And then staying on that data piece, the question that I had was on the biggest roadblocks to scaling smart infrastructure solutions in New Zealand? So policy, funding, regulation, or something else completely?
Oh, look, I think a challenge around scalability is potentially influenced by, I guess, where you see aggregation in the same way as scalability. So, for example, if you're running a pilot around the use of let's just say a smart infrastructure program. So, for example, you're a local authority and you build out a set of use cases, and one of the first use cases might be, how do we solve a problem around where we put new lighting, for example? So how do we make decisions around where is the most impactful and most valuable place to put new lights and that sort of infrastructure? Well, if you go ahead and implement that, then yes, you might solve that particular problem, but your next use case might have nothing to do with lighting, for example. It might be around, okay, so now how do we address challenges that we have around our Three Waters data, for example. So if you look at all of your use cases in isolation, then I guess what we're starting to see is that it's really difficult to scale that in terms of what do we learn from that project into this one and onto the next one. So I think sometimes we see that when asset owners are approaching, sort of problems in isolation. But the flip side of that is if you take a step backwards and say, what are all the problems that we're trying to solve? And that's, I guess, sometimes where that concept of the digital twin comes in, is how do we take an ecosystem or system view of all of the problems? Then it starts getting really big really quickly. So the challenge is to hold that balance. How do we solve specific use cases but still maintain a thread that goes through that is useful to the next one and the next one and the next one? And I guess in my opinion, that's the place of what data did we use? Did we enrich the information that we had about particular assets? Are we creating sort of standard processes for implementing things? Is there knowledge that we can carry over? So that kind of piece, making sure that that's accounted for, is probably the challenge, or one of them.
Yeah, one of them. So it's almost one of the biggest roadblocks is the existence of basic building blocks and that digital learning from each project being fed back into overall business practice. The final question that we had was, if you could change one thing today to accelerate smart infrastructure adoption in New Zealand, what would it be?
That's a good question. So I think the previous answer around, this need for scalability, there's a similar view potentially that when we are investing in smart infrastructure or digitization activities or any activity to solve a particular problem, sometimes it's also at an isolated phase of the asset or project lifecycle. So for example, we very rarely design for operation. So when you're doing a traditional built environment project, for example, regardless of the contract type, designers do the design, constructors do the building, and then it gets handed over to the facility owner for ops and maintenance. Very rarely do our designers, or does our design get clear requirements around how we could improve the operations or maintenance of that facility once it's kind of gone live. And so I'm conscious that also creates a somewhat bigger challenge, but that would be really useful, I think. So, for example, here in Christchurch, as we're building the Metro Sport facility, so Parakiora, which is about to go into operations in the next couple of years. So there is a tremendously large and complex network of sensors built into the design of that building. What we could be doing in parallel is starting to think about what data that might produce, how that data can be used in order not just to make the facility perform better, but to influence all sorts of other things like usability and working out how we could get more from the building in terms of its ability to service different needs of the community, for example. So my wish would be that there's a little bit more integration between asset and project life cycles and the supply chains that operate within those. And I think then we can get that holistic view of what the data could and should be telling us and how we can use it for better outcome.
And then final one is your key message to government and industry leaders who want to see New Zealand take the next step in infrastructure transformation.
I think at the moment, with the current state of kind of government involvement in policy and strategy and those sorts of kind of national scale statements or interventions, if you like, which is that there isn't a lot of activity. We could wait for that to change, or we could get on with doing what we can in the meantime. And so that would be my message, is if you're an asset owner or, part of a supply chain, is to really think about the data that we're producing through the processes that we're undertaking, whichever stage of the life cycle we're working in, and just have an understanding of the upstream and downstream impacts of your activity. So data really genuinely is the golden thread, and we're just seeing it across every single industry now where it's starting to become a real challenge. How do we make sure that the asset owners get the asset data returned to them about their infrastructure, and how do they build sort of capability and literacy around the use of that data for future purposes? That would be my message, is start thinking about that and start thinking about investing in, I guess we can say, digitisation activities. So I'm not saying let's invest in digital. I'm saying think about investing in those activities that get you closer to being a better custodian of your asset, because you understand where they are, what their capacity is, what condition they're in, what potential there is. And I wouldn't be waiting for government to solve that problem.